Welcome to Kachi Bachi. This is part 4 in our 4-part series of binding your quilt. So today I'm going to go through 3 different ways that you can actually finish your binding on your quilt. So number 1 will be how I typically finish off my bindings, which is having sewn it to the back. I will now flip my binding over to the front. I will use a stitch in the ditch foot, put a top stitch just shy of the edge of my quilt, and then call it a day. The second way would be if I sewed my binding to the front of my quilt, then I would flip that over to the back. I will stitch in the ditch of that seam that I made and hopefully catch my binding on the backhand side. The third way would be again to stitch your binding to the front of your quilt and fold it to the back and hand stitch it down. Now obviously on this particular quilt I have stitched my binding to the back because that is a typical way that I will do it. I will still be showing you all of those ways, and then we're just going to take those out and finish off my binding. Alrighty, so I'm going to put on my blind hem foot, which I use as a stitch in the ditch foot because it gives me a very nice top stitch when I am top stitching. So the first step for me is going to be putting on this foot. The second step is matching my threads. You'll want to choose a thread that you have, or a thread that most closely matches your binding. This one will do for me. It is what I have on hand. If I were doing this for a quilt that has a different colored binding from my backing, then on my bobbin I would put a monofilament thread, so a clear thread that allows if I mistakenly sew over onto the binding, then if I had blue thread and like a white backing, you would see it going onto the quilt, or on the backing if I had an alternate color. That clear allows you to go between them without too much fuss. If you do use a clear, it is absolutely worthwhile to buy pre-wound bobbins. Trying to wind monopoly or that monofilament thread onto a bobbin is trying to like wind plastic or fishing line onto a bobbin, and you're just never going to get as smooth of a tension as you would if you bought a pre-wound. If you are making a baby blanket, then I would not necessarily recommend using that polyester or that monopoly, because I think it's not recommended for use with children. So I'm going to wind myself a bobbin of this blue, and then we're going to load the blue thread on my machine and we'll get going from there. So what I want to do here is flip my binding to the front side. You absolutely could take and press this if that would make it easier for you. I want to have that edge right on the point. Right now my needle is set center to my foot. I'm going to have my needle stop in the down position, and then I'm going to move my needle once to the right, and that's going to bring that just inside this guide bar on my blind hem foot, or stitch in the ditch, whichever you use. So if I have my needle 1 stitch to the right of that, then it's going to be just inside my quilt binding here when I line up that binding with the edge of my foot. Now when I drop my foot, I'm going to lower my needle by hand, and I need to go over once more. So I will manually lower that by hand and make sure it's going to fall where I want before I actually start sewing. So I'm going to back stitch when I start or stop. I actually find I prefer if I decrease my stitch length. If I shorten my stitch length, because once I get all the way back around, I have to stop sewing in that same place or just past it. If I back stitch when I start there and back stitch when I stop there, that's much more noticeable because you have a longer stretch of back stitching, or back stitching one right on top of the other. By doing it this way, this is kind of like micro stitching, so it's very, very challenging for it to come out or unstitch. When I get back to that same point and have to micro stitch over that to end my seam, it's much, much less noticeable than back stitches right on top of one another. So I'm just gonna micro stitch here for a little bit. Increase my stitch length back to my average and continue my binding from here. So here I have a lot of bulk in my corner. With this particular quilt, I do want to take some of that out if I find that it's not turning nicely. So one of the things that I do, and it's probably my own OCD, but I like to have all of my corners going the same way. So whichever way you do this, starting here at my first corner, you would continue to do it the exact same way all the way around to get the most continuity. I take a sharp edge, whether it's a seam ripper, a stiletto, a stylus of some sort, and I'm going to hold that edge into my fold here, or into my corner of my quilt rather, and fold that over. So when I do that, I get a very, very sharp corner here, and that overlaps just enough for my needle's width of my machine. I use something to hold that in place as I approach my corner, and then I will stitch up to that and stop with my needle down in that corner. Okay, and then now I leave my needle down, raise my presser foot, turn my corner, and continue sewing. Alrighty, so if I were to do my entire binding this way, which is how I typically would, then I would just continue on all the way around my quilt, and I have my points on my quilt, and then my binding stitching on the back. You can also see this corner. It makes a very nice sharp 90-degree turn on both the front and the back, which I very much like. I would probably go back and trim that little thread. There we go. Next, I'm going to walk you through machine binding your quilt where you're stitching in the ditch and catching that binding on the back. And I already know with this, it's a very narrow catch for me with this 2-inch wide binding, but we will attempt it just so you can see the process because I love you. So a lot of people, when they're doing their binding this way, will use wonder clips or some sort of binding clip because they have a 1/4 inch mark on it. The process with that is just lining up that 1/4 inch line on your binding clip with the edge of your binding, and then you would know that you were able to catch it. So let's go back to my machine and we will take a look at how we do this. So it would be the same way that I have it here, except I would have this stitched to the front of my quilt and I would be folding it to the back. So all I do is fold it in one direction this way, and then I will fold that again over the edge of my quilt. So I will make that fold before I get it under my foot. The other difference here is I want my needle in that center position because I want to actually stitch in the ditch here, whereas I moved it to the right beforehand because I was just catching it. So now I have my guide bar lined up with that seam, and I just want to have my binding pulled over enough so that I will actually catch it on that back side. I'm going to micro stitch when I start and increase my stitch length and go forward from here. Again, I would want my needle in the down position when I stop. So doing it this way, I stitch right in that ditch, and then when you flip it over, it catches on the back side and that finishes off your binding. Obviously here it's covering up my points doing it that way, so we are going to take this out because this is not how I would typically do my binding. But that is a very effective way of doing it. The challenge with doing it this way for me is when you get to those corners, you're stitching blind trying to catch those folds, and I just find that I don't get nearly as clean of a binding doing it that way. So I much prefer doing it the way that I showed you before. But this is absolutely a very, very common way of applying your binding and finishing it off. It does a good job. Oftentimes what happens is you will wind up stitching in the ditch and then just missing just a little bit of your binding and having to go back and catch it. Definitely check for it, mark it with a pin, and then make sure you re-sew that area because you don't want any weak spots on this binding. So if you do that, you should be good to go. Alrighty guys, well, the third and final way to stitch your binding is to hand stitch it. So I'm just going to show you how I go about that process. There's a couple different ways. I'll show you both of those stitches that I'm familiar with. You can use either and choose what you prefer. Hand stitching, I do use a very fine thread when I hand stitch, and that way it's invisible, so you typically don't see it. So this is a thread set that I purchased like multiple different colors for applique. So it's a very, very fine thread. This is, I believe, 60 weight. You can use 100 weight, 90 weight, whatever you have. If you do this the right way, then it doesn't really matter what thread color you use because it won't show. So I'm gonna do a red just so that we can see it, hopefully. But as you see, even that red on this quilt, it's kind of hard to show up. Cut yourself whatever length of thread you prefer to work with. I like 18 to 24 inches and go forward from there. So I thread my needle, dun, 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 and take a seat. That's another thing. We're gonna go ahead and take a seat because this is not gonna happen in the hour that I can bind a quilt by machine. This is something I do while watching TV, have done it in the car. I get nauseous in the car doing this, I think, because it's so tedious and takes that eye strain, and I get like nauseous when I read and stuff in the car. But it is portable, kind of, if you want to haul your quilt with you everywhere. Whatever, guys. I'm not judging you. I've totally done it. So, okay. So the first thing I'm going to do is knot my thread, which I do it the way my mom showed me. So I just take a little nibble out of just my topping, and then I'm going to come through and tie that into a square knot. So right over left, and then left over right. And that way it's not slipping through, it's not a knot that's going to just pop all the way through, and then my stitches would start to come out. It is secured to my actual fabric, and it's a very secure start. So again, if I were doing it this way, I would have stitched my binding to the front of my quilt, and I would be folding this to the back. But this, again, for you, because I love you, I'm going to show you how to do a hand stitch binding. So once more, I would fold my binding around to that opposite side, and then this is what's called a ladder stitch or a blind stitch. And so wherever I start, I typically just pull my thread off to the right so I can tell where it is in relation to that knot. And then I'm going to come into my binding and catch just that much, about yay there. And then from here, I will go directly opposite that into my quilt and catch right around that same amount. You want even stitches ideally. So I'm going a little bit through my binding and then a little bit through my quilt, and I would pull that through like that, and we'll progress forward and just continue that same process. So this, again, I'm going to catch my binding right on that fold, come through, and then go directly into my quilt right opposite that, and pull that through. And as you can see, that's completely invisible, makes a very, very nice binding. There's nothing exposed as far as my thread showing. There's no exposed edges on my quilt. And I do like this. I think it's a very beautiful way to finish off a quilt. If I were doing wall hanging, something that I would be looking at on a regular basis. My bed quilt is hand stitched. But that there would go all the way around. This very fine thread is wonderful because if it does start to expose in any area, because it's so thin, it blends very, very well, and so you don't see it. But that would be my blind stitch, my blind ladder stitch. The other way that some people do this is what's called a whip stitch. That is not my personal favorite because you do tend to see that thread a little bit more. But what that is coming around and going in a loop. Instead of trying to go through that seam, you just catch it, come out, and then you progress forward and come right back up. So you're kind of making like a spirally rope, if you would. But with that, you can already see here, you get that little line of thread. And that's not necessarily my favorite, but it is a way that people do this. You can find what you prefer between those. But that whip stitch just creates that little line there. And if your thread matches, then it's really pretty invisible. You can see you have to look for it even with this red thread. It's not the end of the world, but it's definitely not my favorite. So periodically, like every, I don't know, 15, 20 stitches, I will just tie a knot just to secure it for good measure. And then obviously knot it and bury your threads when you get to the end. So then when I'm ready to end, I would do the same sort of thing of taking a little nibble out of my quilt, tying a knot with that. So pulling that snug, tying that into a knot, and then to bury that thread, what I do is I will go into that same knot, and I'm just going to go and push my needle between the layers of my quilt, so it's not coming out on the back, it's just coming through those layers. I would pull that out here and snip it at that point, and that way I'm not cutting it right at that tail. That tail is buried in my quilt, and that is much less likely to come out at the end. So that would be hand stitching. Alrighty guys, that is the 3 ways that you can bind your quilt. Stitching it to the back, folding it to the front, and top stitching, or stitching it to the front, folding it to the back, and stitching in that ditch and catching it on that back side, and lastly, hand stitching. So I hope that this was helpful for you. I hope you potentially learned something and that you can now finish your quilts in a very professional, effective, time-effective way where you get the results that you're after. If you have any questions, send us a comment in the boxes below. I don't know. Drop us a line in the comments. No, drop us a line in the comments. Guys, I don't do this. Thank you for joining us in our final of the 4-part series for binding your quilt. If you haven't seen the first 3, I definitely recommend going and watching those to set yourself up for success in binding your quilts. If you would consider following our channel, you can see more content like this here to come in the future. Thank you again and happy sewing. Husband here wants me to stay up till the wee hours of the morning binding this quilt.